Today's video is brought to you by Wondrium, which is helping you sate your curiosity about, well, just about everything. It's where you find the answers to literally everything you've ever wanted to learn about, and maybe even some stuff that you'd never even thought to learn about in the first place. And when we say everything, we mean it. There's Ivy League professors basically handing out an expert education in Greco-Roman history or philosophy or astronomy. There's also brilliant tutorials, travelogues, documentaries. It just seems to never end. Now, obviously, if you watch my channels, then you probably guess that I see myself as a bit of a lifelong learner, and that's at the heart of why I love Wondrium. There's always new stuff to explore or new challenges to master. An empty afternoon or a slow weekend is the perfect chance to dive into a new section of content and learn something that you'd never thought to learn about before. Like, for example, if you thought, oh, I'd like to write like people write on this channel, well, why not check out the series Writing Creative Non-Fiction? Also, for you history buffs out there, there's a brand new 8-part series from Wondrium called Traveling the Roman Empire that takes you to Rome, Spain, Croatia, North Africa, and more. And for the Americans, tune into the upcoming series America's Great Trails, very cool nature docuseries arriving later this month. So follow the link in the description below for a free trial to check it out. I highly recommend it. It supports the show, and it's a whole new vault of educational content to check out. And now today's video. When it comes to agonizing ordeals, few experiences can compare to that of being shipwrecked. If you're lucky or unlucky enough to escape a quick death by drowning, then you face the bleak prospect of drifting on the open sea, exposed to the blistering sun, caustic salt water, violent storms, hungry sea creatures, and pretty much everything else that nature could possibly throw at you. Depending on what, if any, emergency supplies you have on hand, you will either die within 3 days due to a lack of water, or cling to life for weeks or even months on end until you finally succumb to hunger or one of the aforementioned maritime hazards. Or, against all the odds, you're actually rescued. And even if you do make it to landfall on some deserted islands, many of the world's islands are so-called green deserts, devoid of easily accessible food or water, meaning you'll likely meet the same fate as before, only on dry land. Now, if all of that makes you want to never set foot on a boat ever again, know that it could actually be worse. Much worse. While history abounds with lurid tales of disaster at sea, one shipwreck from 1629 stands head and shoulders above the rest. For those lucky enough to survive the initial sinking faced a threat more dangerous and terrifying than anything in nature. They faced each other. This is the story of the wreck of the Batavia, the most brutal disaster in maritime history. Measuring 56 meters long and weighing 1,200 tons, the Batavia was built in 1628 as the Dutch East India Company's newest flagship. Established in 1602, the company, known by the Dutch initials of VOC, was one of the world's first multinational corporations and a political force unto itself, wielding the power to raise armies, wage war, imprison and execute convicts, establish its own colonies, and even mint and circulate its own currency. Enjoying a virtual monopoly on the East Asian spice trade for nearly 200 years, the VOC was the most profitable company in world history, with a peak worth of 78 Dutch guilders, equivalent to a mind-boggling 7.9 trillion, yes, you heard that right, trillion dollars today. On October the 27th, 1628, Batavia set sail from Texel in the Netherlands on her maiden voyage, accompanied by a fleet of 6 VOC merchant ships. The fleet was bound for the capital of Batavia in the Dutch East Indies, what is today Jakarta in the Republic of Indonesia. Aboard Batavia were 330 people, including 180 sailors, 100 VOC soldiers, and a handful of wealthier passengers, including 22 women and their maids. The ship also carried a cargo of supplies for the Dutch East Indies colony and $35 million in silver coins to exchange valuable nutmeg and other spices. Like all VOC ships, the Batavia operated under a split command structure, with skipper Arian Jacobs being subordinate to Commander Francisco Pelser, a high-ranking merchant officer in charge of protecting the company's financial interests. As it happens, Jacobs and Pelser detested one another, having fallen out years before when Jacobs drunkenly insulted Pelser in public. While this made for an inauspicious start to the voyage, the worst was yet to come. Also on board the Batavia on her maiden voyage was one Geronimus Cornelis, an apothecary or pharmacist from the Dutch city of Haarlem. In November 1627, Cornelis became embroiled in a scandal when his 3-month-old son died of syphilis, a disease the child was alleged to have contracted from his mother and ultimately Cornelis himself. Disgraced and with his future business prospects ruined, Cornelis sold off his apothecary shop and other assets and fled to the Dutch East Indies to start a new life. Cornelis' syphilis, which may already have started to affect his brain, has been put forward as a possible explanation for the horror which was about to unfold. Another major reason for Cornelis fleeing the country was his adherence to the teachings teachings of Dutch painter Johannes van der Beek, whose unorthodox Rosicrucian beliefs had been denounced by the Dutch Reformed Church as heresy and landed the artist in prison. As we shall see, these beliefs, which included the conviction that there was no heaven or hell and that the organized church was a sham, were also to greatly influence Cornwallis's future actions. Batavia and two of her accompanying ships reached the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa in April 1629. Shortly after departing the Cape, Batavia became separated from the fleet and found herself far off course. While this diversion is typically attributed to navigation error by skipper Jacobs, it may well have been deliberate, for by this time the animosity between Jacobs and Commander Palsert had reached a breaking point. Jacobs began plotting a mutiny against Palsert, hoping to use the ship's vast cargo of silver coins to start a new life somewhere in the Far East. Palsert would later allege that the supposed navigation error was in fact a deliberate attempt by Jacobs to isolate the Batavia and facilitate the mutiny. In his plotting, Jacobs found a willing conspirator in Geronimus Cornwallis, who harbored similar fantasies. But in order to carry out their plan, the pair first had to win the loyalty of the crew. And so, one night, as the Batavia was approaching the west coast of Australia, a group of masked men attacked the 27-year-old passenger Lucretia Jans. They hung her over the gangways by her ankles, smeared her with excrement and pitch, and sexually assaulted her. The attack was intended to provoke Commander Palsert into collectively punishing the crew, allowing Jacobs and Cornwallis to paint Palsert as a tyrant and turn the crew against him. However, the plan backfired, as Lucretia Jans was able to positively identify her attackers. But before the would-be mutineers could be punished, disaster struck. In the early morning hours of June 4, 1629, Batavia struck a reef in the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands, a small archipelago 70 kilometers off the Australian coast. As the sharp coral tore open the Batavia's wooden hull, Commander Palsert, realizing his ship was doomed, ordered the passengers and crew evacuated. Over the next few days, most of the surviving passengers and crew were ferried using the ship's boats to nearby Beacon Islands and Traitors Island. Remaining aboard the ship were some 70 sailors and soldiers who availed themselves of the Batavia's vast cargo of alcohol and soon became rip-roaring drunk. Unfortunately, the pounding surf soon tore Batavia apart and all but 20 of the inebriated stragglers drowned. Among the survivors was Geronimus Cornwallis, who spent 2 days clinging to a section of the ship's bowsprit before finally washing ashore on Beacon Islands on June 15th. In the end, 275 of the Batavia's 330 passengers and crew survived the initial sinking, but the outlook for the marooned survivors was bleak. The Houtman-Abrolhos Islands are little more than barren coral outcrops with little food and even less fresh water. Realizing that the handful of supplies salvaged from the Batavia could not sustain 275 people for long, Commander Palsert, along with Jacobs and the senior officers, 50 crew and passengers, climbed aboard the ship's 9-meter longboat and set off in search of fresh water on nearby islands. When this search turned up nothing, Palsert decided to head for the Australian coast, sighting land on June 9th. Unfortunately, the expedition was struck by a severe winter storm, preventing them from making landfall. Palsert and his crew battled heavy seas for 2 straight days, struggling to stay afloat before sailing north in search of calmer weather further up the coast. Though they eventually succeeded in coming ashore, there was little water to be found, and Palsert made the decision to sail north to Batavia, some 2,000 kilometers away. And for more on another famous mutiny that ended up in an epic open boat journey, please do check out our video, What Really Happened After the Mutiny on the Bounty, on our sister channel, Highlight History. The journey to the Dutch Indies took 33 days, at the end of which Palsert and his crew were rescued by a passing ship, the Sardam, which carried them the rest of the way to Batavia. Upon arriving in the capital, Palsert had Jacobs and boatswain Jan Everts arrested for negligence and sexual assault prior to the Batavia's sinking, unaware of Jacobs' role in the abortive mutiny. Meanwhile, Batavia's Governor-General Jan Pieterzoon Cohen gave Palsert command of the Sardam and had the ship re-provisioned to mount a rescue mission. And so, on June 15th, 1629, 41 days after the Batavia ran aground, Palsert and a crew of 40 set off in search of her surviving crew and passengers. So by now you're probably thinking, Simon, that doesn't sound so bad. I've heard of dozens of shipwrecks far worse than this one. Well, in that case, brace yourself. For while Commander Palsert was searching for water and readying his rescue mission, back on the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands, a scene of horror was playing out, so cold-blooded and depraved that even 400 years later, it still has the power to shock. With Palsert and Jacobs gone, the highest-ranking officer on the islands was none other than Geronimus Cornwallis, who, despite having no sailing or military experience, appointed himself leader and assumed command of an elected council of survivors. While this might have made sense at the time, there was the minor problem that Cornwallis was a raging psychopath and would soon turned the tiny islands into hell on earth. The trouble started when a subordinate revealed to Cornwallis that he had leaked the mutiny plans to Commander Pelset. Realizing that rescue would mean arrest, imprisonment, or even execution, Cornwallis hatched a plan where he and a crew of followers would hijack the next passing ship and live a life of piracy on the high seas. But as such a ship might not come for several months, Cornwallis had to first ensure that the limited supplies would last and eliminate anyone who might oppose his plans. On July the 5th, Cornwallis dissolved the original Survivors' Council and appointed his own, composed entirely of men who had plotted mutiny prior to the sinking. He then placed all of the supplies and weapons under his control and sent a group of 22 unarmed VOC soldiers, led by Weeb Hayes, to nearby West Wallaby Island to search for a source of food and water. The soldiers were instructed to send up smoke signals if they were successful, whereupon a boat would come to pick them up. Assuming they would be unsuccessful, Cornwallis abandoned them on the island to die of thirst and then set about taking control of the remaining survivors in Beacon Islands. What followed was a violent reign of terror, in which Cornwallis and his followers, mostly fellow mutineers from before the sinking, summarily executed anyone who opposed them. The methods of killing were particularly brutal, with victims being strangled, bludgeoned, hacked to pieces with axes, or set adrift on crude rafts to drown. The mutineers were indiscriminate in their killings, targeting men, women, and children, even newborn babies. Executions were performed singly or in large groups, with survivors often being coerced into killing each other in exchange for their lives. Meanwhile, the women were distributed among mutineers as sex slaves, with Cornwallis reserving Lucretia Yarns for himself. At one point, one of the mutineers set his sights on the daughter of lay preacher Gisbert Bastaines, who was presented with a terrible choice: hand his daughter over in marriage or have her forcibly taken away to be used in common by the mutineers. Taking what he saw as the lesser of two evils, Bastaines handed his daughter over. But worse was yet in store for the poor man. After feebly attempting to criticize Cornwallis' rule, Bastaines and his daughter were invited to dine with Cornwallis. As the pair ate, a gang of men were dispatched to murder Bastiennes' wife and 7 remaining children. Though he would later be criticized for not doing enough to oppose Cornwallis, Bastaines and his daughter would be among the few of the Batavia's passengers to survive the whole ordeal. Soon, Cornwallis' men began murdering the survivors dispersed on the neighboring islands, who greatly outnumbered the mutineers and posed a threat to their rule. In the end, Cornwallis and his followers would be directly responsible for the deaths of at least 110 people, a third of the Batavia's original complement. Yet Cornwallis, unshackled by the constraints of civilization, driven by his heretical beliefs and possibly suffering from neurosyphilis, expressed no remorse over the killings, maintaining to the end that God had sanctioned his actions. Meanwhile, the expedition Cornwallis had sent to die on West Wallaby Island had been unexpectedly successful, finding not only abundant fresh water, but also a population of wallabis that could be hunted for food. Unaware of the massacres taking place on Beacon Island, on July the 9th, the soldiers lit the prearranged smoke signal. They were puzzled when no one responded or sent a boat to retrieve them, but soon survivors fleeing the carnage began arriving on West Wallaby Island and informed Weeb Hayes of what had been happening. Having been stripped of their muskets and swords by Cornwallis, the 47 soldiers, who dubbed themselves the Defenders, improvised clubs and spears from driftwood and nails from the Batavia and built a small fort on the aptly named Slaughter Point out of stone and coral blocks. This fort survives to this day, the oldest European structure in Australia. Upon learning of the soldiers' survival, Cornwallis vowed to destroy them and eliminate the last remaining resistance to his rule. So on July the 27th, he and a group of 22 mutineers launched an attack on West Wallaby Island. On paper, the mutineers had the upper hand, being armed with muskets, swords, and pikes, but the defenders, being better trained and fed, easily repelled the assault. Undeterred, Cornwallis, who had begun referring to himself as the not at all delusional title Captain General, tried again on August the 5th, but was once again repelled. While the mutineers were forced to cross between the two islands on the Batavia's longboat, the defenders were able to stand and fight on solid ground, giving them the tactical advantage. Brute force having failed, Cornwallis instead turned to subterfuge. First, he attempted to drive a wedge between the 6 French soldiers in the garrison and the rest of the defenders, sending one of his soldiers to deliver a letter written in French. However, the defenders immediately saw through the plan and simply took the envoy prisoner. Cornwallis next tried to lay an ambush, offering to meet with the defenders on the beach and negotiate a truce. Meanwhile, 2 mutineers snuck up in a longboat and attempted to shoot the defenders with muskets. Unfortunately, the mutineers failed to keep their gunpowder dry, and the muskets misfired. Growing increasingly impatient, Cornwallis and his 5 compatriots arranged further negotiations the following day, during which they surreptitiously attempted to bribe the defenders with cloth, jewels, and silver coins. But once again, the defenders were not fooled, and they proceeded to seize all 6 mutineers. Only 2 men survived the ordeal: Cornwallis, whom the defenders kept alive, and mutineer soldier Walter Luz, who managed to break free and escape back to Beacon Island. The 4 remaining musketeers were summarily executed. With Cornwallis captured, the mutineers elected Luz as their captain. Armed with greater experience and tactical knowledge, on September the 17th, Luz launched another assault on West Wallaby Island. This time the marketeers were far more successful, wounding 3 defenders and killing 1. As the mutineers pushed closer and closer to the fort, it seemed as though they would finally succeed in wiping out all opposition. But then, In the middle of the raging battle, a ship suddenly appeared on the horizon. It was the Sardom. Plagued by bad weather, the journey from Batavia had taken 63 days, meaning Commander Palsert had been away from the wreck site for more than 3 months. Upon spotting the ship, survivors on both sides of the battle scrambled towards her, hoping to be the first to tell Palsert their side of the story. Weeb Hayes of the defenders reached the ship first, whereupon Palsert, horrified by what had transpired in his absence, sent a force of soldiers and sailors ashore to arrest the mutineers, bringing the whole bloody affair to an end. In the end, only 45 mutineers and 47 defenders remained of the some 225 people Palsert had left behind on the islands. The justice Palsert dispensed was swift and brutal. As the Sardom was already overcrowded, Palsert decided to try the mutineers on Beacon Island. After a brief trial, the worst offenders were taken to nearby Seal Island and hanged. Hieronymus Cornelis had his hands chopped off with a hammer and chisel before he too was executed. As Palsert later recalled, he could not reconcile himself to dying or to penitence, neither to pray to God or to show any face of repentance over his sins, and so he died stubborn. He died as he had lived, not believing there exists devil or hell, God or angel. The Torrentian feeling had spread thus far. Meanwhile, the two most minor offenders, Waterloos and cabin boy Jan Pelgrim de Bay, were marooned on the Australian mainland near Wittakara Creek and were never heard from again, effectively becoming the first European settlers on the continent. In November 1629, the rest of the mutineers were transported back to Batavia, with 7 being tried, convicted and punished via flogging, keel hauling or hanging on the voyage. In Batavia, Cornelis, a second in command, Jacob Peters, was broken at the wheel, the most severe punishment then available, and died of his injuries the following day. Though skipper Arian Jacobs was tortured, he never confessed to his part in the initial attempted mutiny and was released for lack of evidence. His ultimate fate remains unknown. Despite Commander Palsert's heroic 3-month voyage to find water and rescue the survivors of the Batavia, the VOC found him partially responsible for the disaster and stripped him of his rank and financial assets. He died a year later in Sumatra, a broken man. Meanwhile, Webb Hayes, leader of the defenders, was hailed as a hero and promoted to sergeant, while the men under his command were promoted to the rank of corporal. And while the Batavia was declared a total loss, 10 of the 12 treasure chests aboard were successfully recovered. The sinking of the Batavia stands as one of the most violent and depraved mutinies in maritime history, brutally illustrating what horrors human beings isolated from civilization and driven by greed and religious zeal are capable of. It also serves as an alternative foundation myth of sorts for the modern-day country of Australia, predating the more famous 1770 landing of Captain James Cook at Botany Bay by 141 years. So just remember, the next time you set out on the open sea, your greatest enemy may not be the water, the sharks, or even the weather, but rather the person sitting next to you.